The Wolf of Allendale, mysterious English folklore. The morning air was crisp, carrying the bite of winter as the sun barely peeked over the frost-covered hills of Allendale, Northumberland. The land, blanketed in a soft layer of snow, stood eerily quiet. Farmers were used to the cold, to the silence of the early hours, but this morning something felt wrong. James Thompson, a seasoned farmer who had spent his entire life tending to these lands, stepped out of his cottage, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The mist of his breath curled in the air as he made his way toward the sheep pen, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. His flock had been restless the night before, their bleating echoing through the valley, but he had dismissed it as the usual skittishness brought on by the chill. As he neared the enclosure, his steps slowed. Something was off. The usual chorus of soft baying was absent. Instead, there was an unnatural stillness. His heart quickened. The wooden gate hung open, slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. His sheep were never left loose, his brow furrowed as he hurried inside. And then he saw it. His breath hitched in his throat. Blood stained the white snow, streaks of crimson soaking into the frozen earth. His eyes darted across the pen until they landed on the first carcass. A sheep lay motionless, its thick wool matted with blood. Its belly had been torn open, entrails spilling onto the frost, steam rising from the fresh wound. But it was the second sheep that sent a chill down his spine. There was no body. Only a severed head lay on the ground, its vacant eyes staring up at the dull sky, the mouth frozen in a silent scream. James stumbled backward, a strangled curse escaping his lips. He had seen fox attacks before. He had even seen the occasional wild dog ravage livestock. But this was different. This was brutal, calculated, almost unnatural. The wounds were too large, the bite marks too deep. Fear clawed its way into his chest as he spun around, scanning the area. Whatever did this had to be big. But there were no signs of struggle, no tracks, no broken fences, no signs that the sheep had even tried to escape. It was as if the predator had moved through the night like a shadow, striking with ruthless precision before vanishing into the darkness. James wasted no time. He grabbed his shotgun, slung it over his shoulder, and hurried to his neighbor's farm, his boots pounding against the frozen soil. When he arrived at William Harrington's farm, the man was already outside, his face pale. "You too?" James panted, gesturing toward the sheep pen. William nodded slowly. His own flock had suffered a similar fate. Two of his best sheep, one gutted, the other completely missing. And they weren't alone. By midday, at least half a dozen farmers had gathered near the village square, each with their own horrific tale. Sheep were vanishing overnight. Some were left mutilated beyond recognition. No one had heard anything. No one had seen a thing. Fear spread like wildfire. What in God's name could have done this, one farmer muttered, gripping his coat tightly as the winter wind howled through the square. "Foxes don't do this," another replied. "Even wild dogs leave more of a mess. This is something else." A chilling silence fell over the group. They all knew what was being suggested. A wolf. But that was impossible. Wolves had been extinct in England for centuries. The last known wolf had been killed long ago, hunted to oblivion by men who had sworn to protect their lands. "Maybe it's some rabid hound," one of the younger farmers offered hesitantly, but no one looked convinced. James glanced at William. Both men knew this was no ordinary animal. That night no one slept easily. Farmers armed themselves, keeping lanterns burning outside their homes. Livestock were brought into barns, locked behind heavy wooden doors. The village was on edge. And yet, as the moon hung high in the sky and the frost crept deeper into the land, a low, distant howl echoed through the valley. A sound that hadn't been heard in England for generations. The wolf had returned. The once quiet town of Allendale was no longer the same. A chilling fear had seeped into the bones of its people, spreading like a shadow across the frost-covered land. The attacks on the livestock had been horrifying enough, but now there were whispers. People spoke in hushed tones, voices, barely above a murmur, as though afraid the beast itself might be listening. Some claimed to have seen something in the darkness, a shape, a movement, a massive creature lurking just beyond the reach of the lantern light. Thomas Reed, an elderly farmer who had lived in the valley all his life, swore he had caught a glimpse of it just before dawn. "A wolf," he muttered to anyone who would listen. "A beast taller than any hound I've ever seen. Eyes like burning embers. It watched me, like it knew I was afraid." Others dismissed his tale as the ramblings of an old man, but he was not the only one. A young boy, barely 10, ran into the village square one evening, breathless and shaking. His words came out in gasps. "It was there, near the mill, big and dark. It was watching me." The boy's father scoffed, gripping him by the shoulders. "You let your imagination run wild, lad." But the boy shook his head violently, his face pale. It was real. And then came the first newspaper report. On December 5th, 1904, the Newcastle Evening Chronicle printed an article that sent a fresh wave of panic through the town. It spoke of the strange and savage killings, the missing livestock, and the sightings of a shadowy beast. Within days, the story had spread far beyond Allendale. From Northumberland to London, people whispered about the return of the English wolf, a creature long believed to be extinct. Newspaper vendors shouted the headlines in the streets. "The Beast of Allendale. Is a wolf roaming the English countryside once more?" Reporters arrived in town, eager for more details, but the villagers had little to offer except fear and speculation. And so the rumors grew. Some said the beast was no ordinary wolf, that it was larger than any recorded in England's history, that it moved too swiftly, too silently, that it was something unnatural. And then the whispers turned to a name. Captain Bain. The moment the name surfaced, the townspeople had something tangible to hold on to, someone to blame. Captain Bain, a wealthy man from Shotley Bridge, County Durham, had a small private zoo. He was known for his collection of exotic animals, including one that had caused trouble 3 months earlier. A wolf that had escaped. The timeline matched. Could this be the same creature? Had Bain's wolf grown into a killer, stalking the night and spreading terror across the countryside? When confronted, Captain Bain laughed off the accusations. "My wolf," he said, shaking his head. "Nonsense. Ivanovich was barely 4 months old when he escaped, too small to bring down a fully grown sheep, let alone several in one night." But his words did little to calm the villagers' fears. If not his wolf, then what? The unease deepened. Farmers no longer let their livestock roam freely. They built stronger enclosures, reinforced wooden fences, and locked their animals inside the barns at night. Lanterns burned outside homes until dawn, their flickering light a feeble attempt to keep the darkness at bay. Even the town's bravest men hesitated to walk alone at night, clutching their rifles tighter, ears straining for the faintest sound of movement. Then, one evening, a scream shattered the silence. It came from the edge of the village near the old mill. By the time people rushed toward the source, they found a man collapsed on the frozen ground, his face drained of all color. He was still alive, but barely coherent. "What happened?" someone asked, shaking his shoulder. His lips trembled. Eyes, glowing eyes, watching from the trees. The men exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared to check the forest that night. And just beyond the village, hidden in the thick shadows of the trees, something waited. The terror had only just begun. The town had had enough. For weeks, the mysterious beast had stalked their lands, butchered their livestock, and haunted their nights. Fear had turned into rage, and rage demanded action. It started with a meeting, a gathering of over 150 men at the village square. Farmers, blacksmiths, laborers, and even a few former soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, their breaths misting in the icy air. They had guns, axes, torches, and sheer determination. The plan was simple: hunt the creature down and end this nightmare once and for all. At dawn, the men spread out across the fields, moving in formation, their boots crunching over frozen soil. The hunt had begun. They searched the hills, forests, and valleys, pushing through dense thickets and snow-covered paths. The wind howled through the trees, masking any sounds of movement. Hours passed. Nothing. No tracks, no movement, no sign of the beast. Some men cursed under their breath, others tightened their grips on their rifles. It was as if the wolf had vanished into thin air. Then, just as frustration began to set in, a shout rang out from the northern ridge. "Here! Over here!" The hunters rushed toward the sound, their hearts pounding. In the snow, partially covered. By frost they found tracks, massive paw prints leading toward the dense woods. A ripple of unease ran through the group. The tracks were fresh. They followed the trail, moving deeper into the forest, their weapons raised. Then someone spotted it. Just beyond the clearing, in the shadows of the trees, a massive figure stood, still as a statue. A man gasped. Another raised his rifle. For a brief moment everyone saw it. A pair of glowing yellow eyes locked onto them from the darkness. Then it moved. In a blur of motion, the beast bolted through the trees, its form barely visible between the trunks. "After it!" someone shouted, and the chase was on. The men ran through the forest, their torches flickering, their breath heavy in the cold air. They fired shots, but the bullets only struck trees. The beast was too fast, too agile. It weaved through the woods, leaping over fallen logs and disappearing into the fog. By the time the men reached a rocky outcrop, the tracks vanished, not faded, vanished, as if the wolf had never been there at all. The men stood there, panting, their faces grim. They returned to the village, exhausted and empty-handed. Frustration boiled over. Some swore the wolf had been black, others were certain it had been brown or grey. "Are we even chasing the same creature?" one man muttered. Another scoffed. "If there even is a creature." Doubt crept in. Was this a real wolf, or were they chasing shadows and hysteria? But the attacks continued. The next morning, 2 more sheep were found slaughtered. The night after that, another. The wolf was still out there, and it was playing with them. The air was thick with frost as Samuel Whitaker, a middle-aged mill worker, pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. The village of Cumwinton nestled. Just 4 miles from Carlisle, was eerily silent under the pale moonlight. Samuel had worked late that evening, finishing repairs at the old grain mill. As he trudged home along the deserted road, his boots crunching over the frozen earth, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that he wasn't alone. Then, a movement in the shadows. His breath caught. Across the narrow street, near the stone wall that bordered the village, something massive shifted in the darkness. At first it was just a shape, large, low to the ground, unnervingly still. Then, as a gust of wind parted the mist, 2 eyes emerged from the shadows. Burning. Yellow, fixed directly on him. Samuel's heart slammed against his ribs. The stories from Allendale had reached Cumwinton weeks ago, the mutilated sheep, the failed hunts, the whispers of a wolf larger than any seen before. He had dismissed them as exaggerations, the fearful ramblings of desperate men. But now, just standing frozen in place, staring into those unblinking eyes, he knew. It was real. Before he could cry out, the creature moved. Not ran, glided. It leapt. Onto the stone wall with unnatural ease, its body stretching in the moonlight. Samuel caught a glimpse of its form, long limbs, sleek fur, powerful shoulders, before it disappeared into the field beyond. The night swallowed it whole. At that same moment, miles away, engineer Thomas Davies sat in the driver's cabin of the midnight express train bound for Carlisle. It was a bitterly cold night, and the steam from the locomotive rose in thick clouds as the train thundered down the tracks, slicing through the darkness. Davies had driven this route 100 times before. It was routine, predictable, until a shadow appeared ahead on the tracks. For a fleeting second he thought it was a fallen tree, but as the train hurtled closer, the shape moved. Eyes, yellow, gleaming in the moonlight. A beast, massive and wild, stood in the center of the railway, its head snapping toward the approaching train. Davies reacted instantly, yanking the whistle and slamming the brakes. Sparks erupted from the tracks as the steel wheels screeched in protest, but it was too late. The train collided with the beast at full speed. There was a sickening thump, a blur of dark fur, a flash of claws. Then, silence. The train rumbled to a halt a few hundred yards down the track. The railway workers rushed out, their lanterns casting flickering beams onto the tracks. The air stank of burnt coal and iron, mixing with something else, blood. They found the creature's remains strewn along the railway line, its body torn in two by the force of the impact. One of the men knelt beside the carcass, running his fingers over the thick, matted fur. "Bloody hell," he muttered. "It's a wolf." A silence fell over the group. A wolf. In England. At dawn, the railway workers buried the remains beside the tracks. The ordeal, they decided, was best forgotten. But word travelled fast. By midday, reporters from Carlisle arrived, eager for a glimpse of the infamous beast. Rumours spread that a hefty reward was being offered for proof of the wolf's demise, and so greed took over. That evening, the workers dug up the body. They stitched it back together crudely, sewing the halves as best they could before parading it through town. Photographers captured its image, and within days, postcards of the Allendale Wolf were being sold across the country. Was this truly the Wolf of Allendale? Many believed so. The sightings stopped. The livestock killings ceased. The fear that had gripped the countryside for weeks slowly began to fade. But some remained, skeptical. The Hexham Current, a local paper, rejected the claim, stating that the real beast would have left a trail of slaughter on its way to Cumwinton, and it hadn't. And then there was Captain Bain. The moment he heard about the dead wolf, he travelled to Carlisle, appearing at the railway yard within hours. He stood over the corpse, inspecting it carefully. Then, with a strangely calm expression, he said, "This is not my wolf." Was the nightmare truly over? Some villagers swore that even after the wolf's supposed death, they still heard howls in the distance on cold winter nights. Others whispered that something else had been lurking in the darkness all along. Something that had yet to reveal itself. Captain Bain stepped off the train at Carlisle station, his long coat billowing as a sharp winter wind howled through the platform. His face, usually impassive, was unusually tense. He had heard the news. A wolf had been killed by a train in Cumwinton, and the moment he received word, he boarded the earliest train from Shotley Bridge. He had to see it for himself. The railway yard was crowded, buzzing with speculation. Reporters, railway workers, and a handful of local hunters stood around the stitched-together remains of the beast. The stench of death lingered in the cold air, but Bain hardly noticed as he stepped forward. For a long moment he simply stared. The creature lay stretched out on a wooden cart, its fur stiff with dried blood. Its form was massive, far larger than what many had expected. Its eyes, though lifeless, still seemed to hold a strange, eerie presence. Finally Bain spoke. "This," he said, voice calm but firm, "is not my wolf." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A reporter from the Newcastle Evening Chronicle immediately stepped forward. "But, Captain, you claimed your wolf had escaped months ago." "Yes," Bain interrupted, his expression unreadable. "But my wolf was a pup, 4 months old at the time, too small to do this." The people around him exchanged uneasy glances. There was something in Bain's voice, something too rehearsed. And then came the records. Someone, perhaps a curious journalist or perhaps a suspicious local, dug into the official police reports from Shotley Bridge. Bain had first reported the missing wolf as a small pup, barely over 4 months old. Yet weeks later, he described it as nearly a year old. The discrepancies in his statements were impossible to ignore. Had Bain been lying? If so, why? In Allendale and Hexham, the news of the dead wolf spread quickly. For some, it was a relief. The attacks had stopped. The fields were quiet once more. Farmers began letting their livestock roam freely again, their nightly lanterns no longer needed. But not everyone was convinced. In the weeks following the wolf's death, strange rumors began to surface. Some claimed they still heard howls at night, distant but unmistakable. Others swore they saw something moving at the edge of the forest, watching from the darkness. A few even whispered that a second wolf still lurked somewhere in the hills, waiting for its moment to strike. "The real beast is still out there," an old shepherd muttered one evening in the local pub. Mark my words. For years, the legend of the Allendale Wolf faded into local folklore, a story passed down in hushed voices, a ghost tale told on cold winter nights. And then, in 1971, something happened. Hexham, England, a quiet afternoon. Two young boys, Colin and Leslie Robson, were digging in their garden when their shovels hit something solid. Curious, they kept digging until two strange stone carvings emerged from the earth. The objects were roughly shaped heads, one resembling a man, the other something else, something half human, half wolf. Their parents, puzzled yet fascinated, placed the stones inside their home, and that was when the disturbances began. Over the following weeks, bizarre events plagued the Robson household. Doors creaked open on their own in the dead of night. Objects moved from place to place with no explanation. The family dog whimpered and refused to enter certain rooms. But the most chilling incident came one evening when the mother, Mrs. Robson, awoke to find a towering figure standing in the hallway. She described it as a monstrous shape, half wolf, half man, with piercing eyes that glowed in the dark. Within moments, the figure lurched forward, only for it to vanish before her eyes. The family, terrified, got rid of the stone heads. But the reports didn't stop. Over the years, multiple people claimed to have seen a similar creature lurking in Hexham, an entity that seemed neither fully human nor fully beast. Was it real, or just the echo of a forgotten legend? Even now, in modern-day Allendale, the memory of the wolf refuses to fade. Every year, on the last Saturday of September, the townspeople gather in the square. A large effigy of the Allendale wolf is set ablaze, its flames licking the night sky. And as the fire crackles and burns, the people throw back their heads and howl, a chilling, haunting cry that carries through the hills, a reminder that some legends never die,